And from the Liberals, they're even standing on different sides of the demonstration. From the Liberals, Hedy Fry and Joyce Murray. And also from City Council, Ellen Woodsworth is here as well. I now want to bring up your next speaker. She's from Fair Vote Canada, an organization that has been working for a long time to make this a more democratic country. And my hat's off to them, well, not literally, but I would like to have you all welcome up Ms. Shoni Field, everybody.
I think I'm far too short for this. I'd just like to start off by saying how incredibly encouraging it is to see people coming out across the country. Closer? Okay. Coming out across the country for the last 3 weeks, and today we've seen thousands and thousands turning out at events across the country to say we do care. This is not the chattering classes, this is not the discontent, these are Canadian voters and we care. Regardless of our partisan preferences, as Canadians, we feel deeply uncomfortable with the idea that Parliament can be prorogued at the whim of the Prime Minister, at any Prime Minister. We feel uncomfortable. Now, prorogation was an ancient prerogative of kings when they didn't get their way. But this was back in the day when democracy wasn't fully formed yet, when we were trying to figure out how it worked. We were developing it, not a true democracy. And democracy doesn't work that way. When you don't get your way, you shouldn't be able to pull the plug. But unfortunately, it seems we've regressed, perhaps about 400 years. We have bills still on the table, an important investigation underway, an agenda not yet complete. So when Parliament was suspended for several months on December 30th, it was hard to escape the inevitable conclusion that it was done to spare the government the bother of being accountable to Parliament. It was done to spare the government the bother of being accountable to the Canadian people. Sometimes democracy is a little inconvenient, but this is not democracy. Under prorogation, Parliament became irrelevant and the government no longer accountable to the people's elected representatives. All parliamentary committees shut down, no question periods, no debates, bills swept off the table. When prorogation is used in these circumstances, it is to block democratic debate. It is to block investigation and some of the meager checks and balances that our system has. Prorogation in these circumstances says there is no role for the people's representatives. Do we agree with that? No! Prorogation in these circumstances essentially says there is no role for the people. Do we agree with that? No! Prorogation in these circumstances is a sign of profound disrespect for the voter and for democracy. So, what happens when we get on this slippery slope? Well, when Parliament loses its ability, its legitimacy, its role, your children and their children will have no institution capable of reining in an autocratic leader or a government that's out of control. And the ability of the people to rein in their leaders is the foundation of democracy. There is a very, very important thing at stake here, and that's why it's so amazing to see people across the country saying, we do care, this is not the Canada we want. But so obviously we need to start looking for some solutions. But before we start, I think it's important to take a step back and see what the problem is. One party is not the problem. Amazingly enough, prorogation is not the problem. It's merely a symptom of the problem. So we talk about what would happen if, in the future, on this slippery slope, Parliament loses legitimacy, loses authority, loses its role, but we have to acknowledge that we are 3/4 of the way down that slippery slope. The uncomfortable truth is that with or without prorogation, our Parliament is not able to meet our ideals right now. It is not a strong body capable of providing checks and balances to the government and Prime Minister. It can be dissolved without its consent on a whim. And it is not a representative body speaking for all Canadians. And I think that is the root of the problem. The reason why governments of Canada know that they don't truly have to be accountable to the Canadian people is we don't have a representative body that speaks for all Canadians. When Canadians are represented fairly in Parliament, then Parliament gains in legitimacy, it gains in strength. And when Parliament truly represents the Canadian people, then the government disregards it at its peril. The government is accountable to Parliament, and Parliament is accountable to the people. That's how it's supposed to work. And this lack of accountability is always going to lead to crisis. It might be a questionable suspension of Parliament, it might be a sponsorship scandal, it might be some other scandal. But I truly believe until we get to the root of the problem, our country is going to continue to be plagued by the arrogance of unaccountability. And so politicians of all stripes have some time on their hands the next little while, an unexpected vacation. So when school's out, I suggest some homework. Canadian people have sent a strong message that we will not allow the Parliament and government to disregard us. We will not be disregarded. We are sick and tired of our governments being unaccountable, and I think it's time we have not just some mutterings about democratic reform, but true democratic reform. So I think as Canadian citizens, we should demand the following basic democratic rights. We should demand to be able to cast an equal and effective vote and to be represented fairly in Parliament, regardless of political belief or place of residence. We should demand to be governed by a fairly elected Parliament where the share of seats held by each political party closely reflects the popular vote. And we should demand to live under legitimate laws that have been approved by a majority of elected parliamentarians representing a majority of voters. The current winner-take-all system is absolutely inconsistent with these fundamental democratic rights. And as a result, Canada is faced with a spiraling democratic deficit. The need for reform is absolutely urgent. We need a Parliament that represents the political and social diversity of Canada, and we need a Parliament that can hold our government accountable. So before prorogation, Fair Vote Canada had launched a declaration of voters' rights, calling on the House of Commons to immediately get to work on amending the Canadian Elections Act to incorporate these vital democratic rights I spoke about. So in the absence of a House of Commons able to do their proper work, I suggest that politicians of all partisan stripes take this time to figure out how they can come back from their unexpected winter break with a plan to move immediately on answering this call for Canadians to have fundamental democratic rights.